You're listening to Mark of the Maker. Hey everybody, I'm Mark Steiner and you're listening to Mark of the Maker, and this is episode 74 of the show, and we have a special guest to join us this time. Very interesting conversation to ensue. I'm quite sure Sean Kendrick isn't able to join us this week. He's got some family stuff to tend to, and we always have a family first rule with the show. So Sean's off taking care of business for home stuff. And so we do have Tom Crine.
Hey, guys.
And we have Mr. Michael Birch.
All here.
Before we get rolling and introduce our guest, Michael, you want to thank our special supporter?
Well, yeah, it's George Palagonia, an American Metal Exchange. For all your metal and alloys, your titaniums, your zirconiums, your damasteels, all that fun stuff, hit up amxinc.com. It's been nice enough to help us out with some show stuff here, so go visit them. Buy all your good stuff. Say hi.
Yeah, George of American Metal Exchange. He's been with us. He's full season supporter, so we really appreciate George, at least partway through the season. He looks like he's going to stick out with us here through until the end, which is wonderful. And I like that intro, Michael. It had a little Texas used car dealer kind of.
Well, yeah.
Come on down to George's.
He's usually at a lot of shows too. I mean,
he is.
Look him up. Say hi to him.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So we do have a special guest with us this time, as I mentioned. It is a knife maker, designer, and probably lots more. We'll get into some of that. Mr. Jens Anso.
Hello.
Hello.
Hey, Jens. Glad you're here.
Hey, Tom. How are you doing?
Good.
Tom just sent a picture of his snacks. He's fully loaded. He's got all kinds of stuff going on over there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, you got to be prepared for the show, right?
It's true.
You know, it's like getting popcorn and going to the movies.
Right. When you do a long form show, you have to be stocked with supplies. I'm surprised Tom isn't using some kind of special backpack and a titanium backpacking stove, and maybe that's if you recorded from the field.
Yeah, well, this is just snack stuff. Nothing hot. I could put my grill in here.
You could.
Sweet.
Yeah. Do a little Korean barbecue thing, set it up in the office. That'd be wonderful.
Oh, yeah.
All right.
Next time.
Yeah. Enough about snacks. Jens, thanks for joining us from far away.
Yep, you're very welcome.
Folks that have been listening to the show for a long time will remember that at our first Blade Show episode where we talked to some people on the floor of Blade Show and rolled a bunch of clips in. Jens did an intro for us back then and has been listening to the show for a long time, I think. So very cool to have you take the time to join us. And we got to juggle some time zones to get it straightened out. But yeah, we're good. So Jens, for people who are not familiar with you and where you are and kind of starting from the beginning, why don't you explain to folks kind of what's going on and where you're at right now and where you're talking to us from?
Yeah, sure thing. Well, I'm 40 years old. I've been making knives for 32 of those. I started making knives in 1989. I grew up in kind of rural Denmark, not on a farm, but in farm area. My dad bought a house a couple of years before I was born and lived there with my mother and my 3 older siblings. And he actually bought the house in the countryside so that he could bring his boys up in an environment that would create a natural situation where he could learn us how to use tools and fix things and work in the forest and go hunting and stuff like that.
Okay.
So that was kind of the environment, and in a year or in a period of time, there were kind of like what Tom and And Michael has described where you would just run around in the neighborhood, in the forest, and unsupervised, and just make a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's what your dad was looking for, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think it was. I remember we had this ship bell on at the front door, and my mom would just ring it for 30 seconds, half an hour before dinner, and you could hear it about a mile away. So that was how we solved that issue.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would just, it was gravel roads, and I would just ride my bike around and take hikes in the forest nearby. I grew up near one of the largest forests in Denmark, so there was just miles and miles and miles of uncharted territory for a young boy.
Very cool.
Were you hunting at all, or was it more just adventure and exploration?
As a kid, and by myself, I wasn't hunting, but well, I did have air gun and stuff like that, and I would try and kill some birds now and again, but luckily I was a very bad shot. But but I grew up with hunting, and I joined my dad going hunting basically since I could walk. So I had that in with the mother's milk, if you will.
Yeah. So you said you were the youngest?
Yeah, I'm the youngest of four, and I'm kind of the late one. My brother is 7 years older than me, and I have two older sisters that's 13 and 14 years older than me, or something to that effect.
Yeah, your parents had a very broad range of age, it sounds like, with your kids. That's
yeah. And they were up in their age when they had me. They were in the late 30s, so I've at least felt they were quite old, but I'm sure they would disagree.
I'm confident they would disagree, especially your sisters. They don't like that.
No, not at all.
With that much age difference, sometimes it's not so common to spend that time with your siblings. Did you find that with your sisters you didn't spend as much time with them since they were so much older?
Yeah, exactly. They moved out when I was very little, so my childhood was with my brother, basically.
Okay, so outdoor things. That's a common theme, it seems.
Yeah, it is. So it was farmland, and we would grow grain, and we had a few cows, and we would chop firewoods. Basically, how I recall it, every Sunday morning at 7 a.m., my dad would wake me up and say, "We have to go out and make some firewood." Wee-wee. So
yes.
I see it now as a very good thing and something that creates character. That was definitely not how I felt it back then.
Of course not.
But the cool thing was that I was probably 10 when I was allowed to use a chainsaw. So that's cool.
Yeah.
And drive the car in the gravel roads. And
there you go.
Shoot guns and stuff like that. So you have to take the sour with the sweet, I guess.
You said that you hunted very early with your father. Was this deer or stag?
Deer, European deer, red deer, I think it's called. Hare, pheasants was the main game.
Now, I don't know much about it except for like just watching Danish movies and stuff, but they always portray like, and I don't know how accurate it is, like deer camp with a lot of family and friends and stuff was a big thing. Is that a little bit true, or?
Yeah, well, maybe not so much as a camp, because you would just meet up in the morning, and then if you're hunting on farmland or the forest, you would just meet up and discuss the day, and then I'm not quite sure what that kind of hunting is called, but you would have a line of shooters, and then you would have guys with dogs walking through the area.
A push. You're pushing the deer towards the...
Exactly, yeah.
Like a drive.
And my dad would always have dogs, so we would always be walking for miles and miles and miles, so see a lot of interesting foresters.
Yeah, that'll teach you some character too, getting mud on boots and treading for miles.
No, I really enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed more the time with my father and the time with all the other guests at the hunt, more so than the hunt itself. And I still go hunting every now and again, a couple of times a year, and it's still for me more the camaraderie and the social thing of the hunt that drives me more than the hunt itself. I do like hunting, and I do go deer hunting in the summer, and I enjoy that, and only shoot what I intend to eat. But it's not the hunted in itself is secondary, I would say.
Yeah, I didn't realize that till I was much older that really for me it was just getting out there and sitting in a tree stand. It really didn't matter if I shot anything or not.
Yeah, exactly.
You're just sitting around looking at stuff.
Yeah, it's when you get to the point where you're mature enough to understand it, there's a really beautiful piece about that whole situation, right? But I know as a young guy, for me, it was always hard because it's like, why are we still walking? Like we're in the woods. We've been out here all day long, and it was, in retrospect, it was very, very cool. And like Jens said, right, you get to see lots of beautiful things and interesting stuff, and learn a lot of things along the way. All that, in many cases, you're not realizing that you're learning, or you know what I mean, seeing things that not everyone gets to see, or whatever.
Yeah, and you get a lot of insights into how adults act when you're in that sort of situation. It's a very growing type of situation you can be put in.
Yeah.
But the obvious question is, did that intrigue you or get your interest in knives? Is that what caused that?
I would say, indirectly at least, in that I recall very specifically an episode where I was probably 5 years old, and this older gentleman had just shot a bird, and he handed it to me and said, "Put this in your belt." And I was like, how should I do that? And he looked at me like I was completely stupid, and explained that, well, any boy should have a pocket knife and a piece of string in his pocket. And so you could use the string to tie a loop and tie the bird to your belt, and the knife was just obvious. I never really bought the string thing, but soon after that, I started carrying a pocket knife with me everywhere I went. And the environment that I grew up in was just perfect for carrying a knife, and you would use it daily for any of the chores or activities that we were doing. But about a couple of years later, my dad gave me this big box of old magazines that he bought when he was a teenager or a young man, called Popular Mechanics. And so this was the Danish translated issues, but in one of them I was just chewing my way through these probably 100 issues of magazines, and they were just perfect for the environment that I grew up in that I had access to a lot of the stuff that they were talking about, like tractors and wood shop and tools, and it explained how you could build anything from a sailboat to a little table for your movie projector or whatever. And I was fascinated by building things at a very early age. But in one of these magazines from early 50s or late 40s, there was an article about how to make a hunting knife. It didn't say in the article, but I learned later that it was the article about Randall knives. And for some reason they skipped the name in the translation. But but it showed, I guess, the number 1 7-inch fighter, how that was made, and just pictures of all their models, and that just struck a nerve with me, and I was so fascinated by the idea of building a tool like a knife yourself, and it was much later that I tried it myself, because I knew that this required machinery and hand-to-eye coordination that I absolutely didn't have at that point. But I kept returning to that article, and when I was 16, I joined this metal shop course, like one evening a week, and I built that first knife, which was somewhat inspired by that article. That was the only reference I had, and I had no idea that anybody else was making knives at that point.
Yeah. Do you think your father gave you that box of Popular Mechanics? Was it a thing where he recognized that you had an interest or a knack for mechanical things, or was it the other way around, that he gave it to you hoping that you would develop more of an interest in that?
I think it's a little bit of both. I'm sure that he saw some creative drive in me, because I've always been making stuff or drawing and just expressing myself somewhat creative. And I think he wanted me to read something a little more relevant than comic books.
Right.
I read a lot of comic books and I never stopped, but I think he was very keen on getting me to read something that I could actually use.
Yeah.
Question for us here. Yeah. Who all between us wanted to buy the plans for the hovercraft in the back of Popular Mechanics?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
Yep.
How could you not want a hovercraft?
It was a hovercraft.
That was a very, I guess, underrated to me sort of magazine. That was so great of a magazine.
Didn't they also have the Gatling gun and 22 plans? Was that
I think so.
That magazine? I wanted both of those. I figured if you're going to have a hovercraft, it needed a Gatling gun.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I really wanted to build, and probably wanted to build before building knives, but never tried my hands on, was a crossbow with a magazine loaded mechanism in it. Oh, that was so cool. I remember I made a few bolts, but that was about it.
That's interesting. That'd be a fun one.
Would be pretty cool.
Yeah.
So when it comes to the knife that you said you bought it as a kid, where were like general stores, or where could you go to buy a knife in Denmark as a kid?
Well, I would think two places would be in question. One was our local grocery store, which was dealing with anything from milk to eggs to shovels and tools for the farmers. And I'm sure they have to have had some pocket knives. I can't recall exactly, but also the second was the hardware store, or I'm not quite sure what the English word would be, but where you would buy grain and other stuff for your farm. And I recall one of the first, if not the first, folding knife I had was this small German folding, it looked almost like a pen knife. It was a tiny blade, and that was the most common knife that was just available everywhere I looked, and that probably wore 4 or 5 of those down just by trying to sharpen it on a brick or something like that.
Yeah. I assume being that you had farm equipment and other stuff around, you had some degree of tools and all the normal stuff you would have in a farm, some form of a shop to repair stuff, and right.
Yeah, definitely.
Farmers are maybe the all-time kings of ingenuity and coming up with creative and sometimes curious ways to solve problems.
Mm-hmm.
Some more adeptly than others, right? Sometimes constrained by budget and other things, but to me that's one of the interesting keys, right? Is not just having an interest, but also having the facilities or some special tools available really helps a lot, right? There's people that find their way without that, but when you have that stuff at your disposal and you have that kind of mechanical or creative interest, right, that's a very powerful combination.
For sure. And my dad had a fairly well-equipped workshop. It was mainly hand tools, but also a bench grinder. He even had an anvil, even though he didn't forge anything. But he had a lot of wood tools. He was the principal of the school that I was attending. But before that, he was the wood shop teacher. So he had a practical background as well. So he would teach me to use most common tools, and then he just let me loose in the shop. I could use all the tools I wanted, and as long as I was careful, and I could use it whenever I wanted. And I'm really grateful for that, because he didn't necessarily have time to spend with me in the shop, but I was allowed to just go nuts in there. I do recall one of the first knife making sessions was my brother, who would take big nails and forge them into something that was at least sharp in one end. But that was very early on. But I didn't try my hands on knife making myself until 89.
Yeah. Is that mechanical or creative streak or trait or tendency, is that strong within your family? Do your brother and sisters have that, and your parents as well? Or obviously your dad, sounds like if he was a shop teacher or a wood shop teacher, he was a very mechanically adept guy.
I would say that I'm in certain ways, yes, but I'm the only one who's pursued it as a career. My brother is definitely good with his hands, but he doesn't express himself creatively. My sisters have been dabbling with drawings or sewing, stuff like that. Both my parents liked to draw and paint when they were young, and my dad would carve wooden figures. But I think that the way that he was brought up told him that creative things like carving is a good thing to do in your spare time if you have any, but do something proper with your time.
Yeah.
I frankly, I don't recall seeing him ever carve a figure or anything, but I grew up in a house that was packed with stuff that he made. Then when he retired, he started doing a little bit again, and he would carve some wood, make some figures, or he also started carving stone. And I have a few of his figures from that period as well.
Interesting. That's something that I think many people have dealt with, is having some amount of creative interest or skill or natural ability that sometimes gets squashed, right, or suppressed by life. Well, it could be life, right? Sometimes parents, right? I know some very artistic people who I thought were had tons of capability or potential to be artists in some form or another, who were not in a home environment that supported that at all, right?
Yeah.
And saw that as sort of a family would categorize that in the reading comic books category to Jens's example, right? Which isn't terrible, but is something that's maybe more of a not a creative thing, right? More of just like a consumption thing. And so I think it's really interesting when people are given the space to go explore that more and even encouraged, some pretty cool things happen.
Well, I think it was just harder for people to believe that you can make money doing things. You're supposed to go out and be, a good part of society and do what you're supposed to do and have a good job that people respect. And it wasn't always looked at like it is now.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. Also, there was certain aspects of the working life that were regarded higher than others. So my dad's highest dream, I think, was that I became an engineer, and I actually started studying for engineer more or less straight out of high school, but decided this wasn't for me, and he was quite upset about that. But I decided that I wanted to pursue a creative education and wanted to apply for the School of Architecture. And he really didn't really agree with me on that, but on the other hand, he didn't talk me out of it either. So
yeah.
So I think that for him, his highest desire was just to see his kids succeed in life.
Sure.
And maybe struggle a little less than he did.
Yeah, I think everybody wants that. There's a balance somewhere, right? You want your kids to be happy. You also want them to be good people and responsible and to be able to take care of themselves. So somewhere there's a middle happy place that sometimes is hard to find, right?
Yeah.
For lots of reasons.
I'd be so shit scared to have my kid out here doing the stuff that I was doing alone at his age.
Oh yeah.
I don't know how our parents did it.
And yeah. I even have 10 fingers.
Yeah.
Still.
A lot of that surprises me.
Yeah. Yeah. It's when Michael, you and I have talked about that before, right? It's like, is that bad or good? I don't know.
Yeah. I don't either.
Yeah.
Sure as shit scary.
Topic for another day, I guess. Okay. So you kind of were in this, rural environment. You had freedom to go do things, Jens, and so you were on this path, you said, to become an engineer. Was that, it sounds like that was encouraged by your father, but you had this mechanical and creative tendency or knack, right, that I think is lots of engineers benefit from. So how did that path go through your high school or the time leading up to college?
Well, I was somewhat good at math and physics, and my brother became a mechanical engineer. And while that didn't really appeal to me, that kind of direction was kind of a given at that point. But then going into college, I realized that math and physics just really exceeded the level that I could comprehend. I really struggled for a year just to get qualifying grades to move on. And very early on, I actually had the urge to pursue becoming an architect, but I also knew that my grades from high school didn't allow me to just get in right away. So in Denmark, the system allows you either to get in on your grades or by application, where you fill out or you take part of this 3-day test where you show your skill level.
Okay.
And that scared the shit out of me, because while while I've always been drawing, I've always been creative. A guy in my class during school applied and didn't get in, and he was just so good at drawing, and I thought that was the main goal, to be very good at drawing. I later learned that wasn't exactly the case, but that kind of scared me away from going that direction. So, and my grades allowed me to go into college as an engineer. But after 1 year of just insanely high level math, especially, I just had to call it quits, and then try my hands on the School of Architecture. And it took me 2 tries to get in, but I'm super grateful that I actually followed that path. I didn't become an architect in traditional way. After, it's a 5-year master's degree, so after 2 years of where you just explore every different aspects of architectural path, you have to choose your major, and I chose industrial design at that point.
Jens, what a part about the math was the challenge? Was it, so for me, what I struggled with when I was in engineering school was when there was math that I could relate to a physical occurrence or an object or motion of an object, when I could connect that to the math in a way that made sense to me, then that came to me very quickly. But it was the more esoteric things where there wasn't a clear path for me to understand how it connected to something physical or real. That's where my most significant struggle was, and that was a very challenging part of that path.
Yeah, that was the exact same thing with me, because while I was good at math in school, in college, as soon as I couldn't quite understand in what situation I could use this that I was learning, I couldn't keep up. And when you ask, so how do you use this in a practical way? Well, you'll learn that next year.
Right.
and that just didn't work with my brain.
Right.
So for me, being practical about life really is important.
Yeah. Interesting. So you've found yourself on the path of industrial design, which is interesting. I think in our Bob Terjola episode, that's what his educational path was in, right? Wasn't it industrial design also?
Something like that, yeah.
Do you remember, Jens, from that episode?
No, I think you're right to some extent, at least. I don't quite remember myself either, but I do seem to remember him talking about that.
Yeah.
So what does that entail? Industrial design, what were you working on, or what were you planning on working on and drawing?
Well, in school, we were trained in anything from designing a communication device. Prior to FaceTime, we were actually trying to design a communication device where you could see the person that you were talking with. And we were designing wheelchairs, little furniture as well. We were just being given a broad range of objects that you could work on. Some worked on trains, some worked on small cars. One of my projects was this postal delivery vehicle that looked more like a scooter than a car, but we weren't taught really. We were more. It was a project-based education, so you would solve a task, design this object, and then you would just work on that for a month or 2 or 3 months, and during working on your project, you would be giving feedback from your teachers. We weren't taught how to, but taught during if that makes sense.
Yep.
I guess what I'm getting at is, what did you want to design? What were you interested in at that point?
I had some kind of interest in furniture, although I felt that furniture in itself was not broad enough. I didn't really have any specific idea of what I wanted to approach when I was done. I've always had a fascination with designing objects. The knives, of course, was already a big part of my life at this point, but definitely not something that I thought I would be making a living from. But from the experience of the knife making and designing knives, if you could call it designing at this point, I had a fascination with anything that you could hold in your hand. So that size objects, or anything that you would use in connection with your hands or your body, that was the range that I was most comfortable working within. Whereas a lot of my co-students were thinking much larger scale, like trains or cars, and to me that was a little outside of my comfort zone.
What do you think the in-hand stuff appealed to you? Was it just because such a large scale could seem daunting, or was it that you enjoyed things that are handheld and wanted to
I think
pursue that?
I think it's a combination of both. I felt that I was much better at designing something that I could hold and understand, rather than as soon as it became larger, it became a little too abstract for me. And I also think that the fact that I've been working with knives for so long at this point already, that being able to see the end of a project was very much appealing to me. I've always had this need to see a project finished and then start on a new. The moment that it becomes too big, maybe I have a hard time just grasping it all.
Yeah.
Well,
I think that's pretty typical, right? I think lots of people like that. That's the reward in my opinion anyway, that's a common reward in the brain of a person who is creative or who thrives in that project type environment that you described with your industrial design stuff, right? The dessert, the finale is to actually see it happen. And when you can't, that gets very hard.
Yeah. And I think that's what drove me during my studies. But those 5 years in the School of Architecture was just one of the most wonderful parts of my life, because I was just spending 10, 12 hours a day in a creative environment. It was just one big room with drawing tables, and in the beginning 50, 60 students, and towards the end we were 12, 15 students. And it was just a creative environment, and you would gain as much just by walking around and looking at the other projects and discussing those projects as you would working on your own. And that creative environment is something that was I was really thriving in that.
Yeah, it's very powerful, right? It seeing other people do their thing and asking questions about what, why, and how their projects are taking shape, I think is educational on its own, right? And it helps expand your mind and your perspective, and yeah, just being involved in that kind of world, I think is very powerful for someone in a growth time in their life.
Yeah, for sure.
Jens, I've got a question for you. What was your first experience with custom knives? Where did that where did you get started on that as far as like wanting to start designing knives and seeing that kind of thing?
I made knives for probably 3 years without knowing that it was a thing. And then in 91 or 92, I saw this ad in the hunting magazine that there was a hunting fair going on, and there were a handful of knife makers exhibitioning there. And I was like, what? So I went there and talked with these knife makers, and my world just expanded so much. I had no idea that anybody else were making knives, let alone in Denmark. The article that led me to start making knives were 50 years old almost at that point, or 40 years old, and so I had no idea that anybody else were making knives. So I quite fast created a friendship with a few of these knife makers, and although they were quite far away from where I lived, I would visit these guys every now and again. But I recall very clearly that I brought a few of my knives to that show, and these three guys would give me creative or constructive criticism. You can do this a little better, or you should try this and that. And I had lots of questions, and so that was the first exposure to custom knife makers. And shortly after that, after finishing high school, I went traveling. I spent about 6 months, 5-6 months in Australia, and found a copy of Blade magazine in a store, and that again expanded my understanding of custom knives by a great deal. When I bought all the magazines that I could find while I was there, and then I wrote Blade magazine when I got back and ordered any back issues that I could find. So and that really helped me along.
So this was actually before you started like your design school, your college.
Yeah, that was a couple of years before.
So those early knives that you made for the 3 years prior, those were basically based on your exposure through the old Popular Mechanics article about Randall and knives that you made in the shop at the home?
The Randall articles inspired me starting, but then I started going to the library and just try finding anything knife related. So I remember going through microfilm, just searching for anything with the word knife or knives or making or workshop, anything that I could find, just ordering books from the neighbor libraries.
You just dated yourself, Jens.
Yeah, I know. I know.
Kids today,
yeah,
they just jump on the web.
So one of the books that I was able to borrow to rent was the Knives and Knives Makers by Sid Latham. So that was pretty much on permanent loan at my house. Except that every now and again it was reserved to somebody else. Back then you would stamp your library card number in the back of the book. And after a while, I noticed that it was my number and one other guy's number. And years later, I figured out it was Jesper Voxnes.
Oh, really?
Who was making knives at the same time as I was. He started in the same year, and he actually lived something like 25 miles from me, but
wow.
it took.
I actually was wondering if it might not be Jesper.
Yeah, but it was. So
that's awesome.
So that book was fundamental to me. I believe I bought Step by Step Knife Making from an ad in Blade magazine, and a German book, or a German version of a book called Fighting Knives by Stevens, F.J. Stevens, that inspired a lot of the early knives for sure. But the step-by-step knife making, how he made knives in that book was very much how I made the first, 20 knives.
Okay.
By cutting out blades from circular saws and saw blades.
So this was all knives that you were making purely as a hobby or pleasure thing.
Oh yeah,
just
sure.
Curious to learn and try to make something that looked more like what you were seeing photos of in magazines and books and other things.
Exactly.
Were you giving them away to friends or keeping them, or what were you doing with
I kept a handful, but most all of what I made, I gave away. And I recall at a point where everybody was happy and they say, "Oh, it's so nice. How can you make a knife this nice? Or how can you make the metal shine this much?" And I know that they didn't know any better, but I knew at some point at that time but it was crap.
You knew they were being polite.
Yeah, well, I actually don't think they were just being polite, because they just didn't know any better. They saw that I made something and they were impressed. But at a certain level, that feedback didn't cut it anymore. And that's when that was about the same time that I met these other Danish knife makers, who at that point was fairly professional at it, although they also made it as a hobby. We've never really had any full-time knife makers in Denmark, maybe except for one or two prior to me becoming a full-time knife maker.
Okay. Wow, interesting. Okay, so I think we're kind of caught up with knives and maybe to industrial design. So when you started college, you continued to make knives, and were you at home at that time, or was there another workshop that you were able to use during your time at college?
I actually moved away from home when I was 16, 17, and lived by myself quite early on. But when I was in college, I lived in a dormitory, and I had this tiny cellar, like where you would park your bicycle and have some boxes of old crap. And I turned that into a workshop while I was in college. So I had something like 10 square feet, or maybe 20 square feet, where I fit all my tools in there. I built a belt grinder, and I had a small bandsaw, and so it was horrible, but it was a workshop, and I really loved having that. So I made knives during college, and it was about 2 years into college that I found out about the internet. So that was in 97 or something like that. And I found, I guess, Knife Network, Blade Forums, maybe. I can't quite remember exactly what it was called, but I started seeing knives online, and it blew my mind. But I also had this idea that I wanted to sell knives, and I was making more knives than I could give away, really. And I started selling a knife here and there. I would go to these hunting fairs and set up a table, but wasn't selling anything really. I sold a few knives here and there, but I saw potential in the American market for two reasons. One, that it was so established in the US at this point, where in Denmark, how could you charge $100 for a knife? That was unheard of for most for most people. So, but also the style of knives that I made was full tang knives, because that's how I learned to build, or I had at least built for a number of years, and that was not all that common in Denmark either. So I saw some kind of potential in the American market, and started by having a website built, and I tried to create a style of knives, and I guess it was in the 1999 or 98, I actually started selling a knife here and there to the US, which I think to me that was huge, but also just giving that people had faith in sending money across the big pond. That was fairly uncommon at that point, I think.
Yeah. So you finished your studies at university and went into a regular job in the private sector, or did you make your way directly into knives as a profession, or how did that transition happen?
Well, it was in 2001, and I was working on my final project, my graduation project, and had absolutely no desire to become self-employed whatsoever. I couldn't have thought about anything more crazy, really. But at that same time, Tactical Knives, the magazine Tactical Knives, wrote an article about me, but more so about one of my models that I have been selling for a while. And that article alone created a demand, and I got about 100 orders from that article.
Oh, wow.
In the middle of me graduating. and I was a little puzzled about this, and didn't quite have any idea what to do about it. After graduating, I went out for 4 or 5 interviews, which were the number of jobs that was available, at least publicly, but didn't get any of them. And I started thinking about, well, maybe I could make knives until I got a real job.
As a bridge.
Yeah. So I actually took that order book and into a bank and told them that I needed to buy a house so I could build a shop, and told them about my plan so I could support myself until I got a real job. And so I went from college straight into full-time knife making, and haven't really looked back since.
Wow.
So that's 20 years ago today, more or less.
So it went pretty quickly, it sounds like, from your first sales to people in the US using the internet as an interface, right, to the visibility through Tactical Knives. That happened fairly quickly, it sounds like, within a few years.
I think it happened within a year or so. I had this idea that just to encourage somebody to buy a knife from me, I said that if you buy one of my knives, I will give you a discount of whatever, 20%, if you write a review, good or bad. And I learned a ton from I think I sold 10 knives, and I learned a ton from those reviews, and I got some critical feedback, positive as well as negative, but all of it I could use to make a better product. And then I sent a knife to one of the editors of Tactical Knives, who asked for a specific knife. About the same time, I traveled to New York City with my class, and while there, I looked up in Annual Knives to see if there were any knife makers in New York's city area or the state. And I actually went and visited R.J. Martin and spent an interesting afternoon in his shop and saw that you could actually do this. He lived quite close to Macecraft supplies at that time, so I went and bought a big box of micarta, and he gave me a lot of polishing compounds to bring back. And I remember bringing 5 pounds or 6 pounds of this clayish polishing compound in my carry-on bag on the plane, and the security asked, "So what is this?" "Oh, this is a polishing compound for metal, and it can't. It will be ruined if it gets frozen in the checked-in baggage." So I had to carry it on. Yeah, exactly.
Otherwise known as C4.
Yeah. I don't think that would have been a good choice today.
Yeah, no doubt. Oh, I didn't realize that you had went to visit RJ in your in that early New York trip. That's very interesting. Had you been to the U.S. prior to that visit?
No, that was the first. I guess that was in 98 or 99.
Okay.
I knew that there was knife show in the U.S., but they were so much out of my grasp at that point, and would be for a long time as well.
Jens, what was the model that was in tactical knives that got so much attention for you early?
It was a small fixed blade that I called a personal sheep's foot. It was 2-inch blade with partial exposed frame and just a tiny handle in G10, I believe.
I've still got a couple.
Yeah. I remember you bought quite a few of my knives back in the day.
I've still got most of them.
I remember I would correspond with Bud Neely because I saw a great potential in this new sheath material called Kydex.
Yeah.
And he was so helpful in both helping me with the techniques, but also helping me order this the right thickness and from the right supplier. And I also recall during college, I was only making fixed blades at this time, but I knew I wanted to make folders. I just saw some great challenges in that, and I think I made the first folder in that little workshop, and I could definitely tell that I wasn't ready for that. Both my skills and my tools wasn't up to par for that. I bought a bunch of materials from Halpern and got this article with my materials from Knives Illustrated in how to make a line lock folder, and that's my first dab into making folders. I would write letters to knife makers. I thought letters would be more formal and in better style than writing an email. Emails wasn't really a thing for me back then. So I would write letters to Bob Tesseola for one, and a couple of other knife makers, and they were all so helpful in responding. And I would sort out a maximum of 3 questions for each knife maker, just so they didn't get too annoyed about me. But that was my first experience with American knife makers as well as the visit to RJ's.
So when you visited and you came back and you got your loan, did you start buying more equipment with that, or how did that progress?
Well, I bought this old factory space. It's an old dairy factory, where they produce cheese and butter and stuff like that, from 1893. So it's a huge house with only like a quarter of it for living area, and the rest was just available space that wasn't used for anything. So I started building a workshop, 300 square feet, and just setting up the tools I already had, and then just slowly figuring out what I needed. At that point, I already built a belt grinder, it wasn't a 2x72 inch because the Danish or the European standard is a little longer, but my brother helped me build a proper belt grinder. So I actually already had a proper belt grinder in that small 20 square meter basement shop. So I made knives with that and a drill press, and for quite a bit, and just got to know my needs, and just slowly expanding. Belt grinders weren't commercially available at that time, at least not in Europe, or at least not anywhere I could either find or afford.
Right. So you kind of had to make stuff on your own. Is that, we've talked about that before with some of the differences that different situation that new makers have today, where sometimes they come at it as a thing where there's sort of this minimum shop requirement for equipment and other things that they think must be true in order to make knives. And I think in each case with makers that we've interviewed, they often start out in almost every case with something much, much, much simpler. And like you said, slowly work their way toward a more proper shop over a period of time.
For sure. I think that I made knives in the beginning in spite of my tools, not because of my tools, just because what I had was so horrible. And I had absolutely no knowledge about how to use it or how to heat treat or anything. But this passion and drive was just there from that first knife. So, and without that passion and drive, that was just a doomed project, because the number of problems that I endured just trying to figure out how to drill a hole through hardened steel, because that was what I had to work on. Nobody knew around me, and so I recall one of my very good friends from high school started his education as a mold maker, and he introduced me while I was in college to O1 in its soft state, and that was just a whole new world opening up. Actually being able to take a file to a piece of steel, I've never been able to do that, because I was only using steel from circular saw blades or cold saw blades or whatever I could find that I knew was hard. I made quite a few knives from files, but I knew that it was already hard. So if I didn't ruin the timber, maybe I would have a good knife. And that was horribly wrong. but at least I was making knives that could cut afterwards. They wouldn't last for me throwing them around, but they would cut.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about. The time that you were kind of coming through this, it was a transition time for knife making, right? Where early interest really relied on things that date all of us, right? About finding things in the back of a magazine and sending away for a catalog or a book or information, or buying something through the mail only based on either a slip of paper that you received through the post, right? Or a picture that you saw in a magazine, kind of all the way through to the more modern world of internet and like Tom mentioned, seemingly endless resources available and other things. So
Yeah, I actually really enjoy that I learned it the hard way, so to speak. That I was really good at solving problems. And one of my favorite things was looking through various knife making books. And one aspect was, okay, follow the text and look at the pictures to see what the text explained. But what is that tool in the back of that picture that it was only like a blurry dot?
Yeah.
I wonder how he uses that. And I learned so much from stuff that was told in the pictures but not in the text, and just trying to figure out. But it allows me to. I think I have a much bigger toolbox, if you will, for solving problems along the way because of the way that I learned how to make knives than some of the newer techniques that I know today because I watch a YouTube video. Because, okay, what if this happens? I have absolutely no idea. But then again, you just find another YouTube video that explains what to do in that case. But I'm really happy about that struggle. It built character again, I think.
It matters. I think that's a classic thing, right? That sometimes the best lessons or the most valuable lessons are lessons learned through difficulty. And it's kind of an interesting thing to think about when you think about people that have been born into this world where everything's available online, and you can get an instant response from someone on another part of the planet or whatever, right? Which was never a thing before. And so I don't know. I on one hand, it's great because the information is available in such massive amounts that pretty much you can find the answer to most questions on any topic, it seems like, with a little bit of research online. But at the same time, people are not having that same experience as much of going through the struggle portion.
Yeah, I actually also think that the vast amount of information that's out there makes it more difficult for some. It makes it look so easy when you watch a 20 minutes YouTube video. Well, you just have to do this and this and this. Oh, that's so easy. And if you can't do it on your first go, I think that disencourages some people. But if you have no idea how, and you have to try and figure it out, and you actually succeed, that success is huge. But also, to me at least, the feeling that I know that, well, if I could work my way through this, I can work my way through the next problem as well.
Yeah, it builds confidence to overcome those problems.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so you bought this house that has a large shop space attached to it. You're slowly developing a larger set of tools and capabilities on hand. How did it progress from that 100 knife order, which sounds daunting for a very young knife maker?
Yeah, well, it certainly was. And at that point, I was just hungry. I would say yes to any weird order that I would get. And I was getting some really weird orders, and some of them were really exciting, and some of them I felt that I made some of my best at that time, and some of it was horrible. And that, I think that was a good experience for me to learn what did I want to make, what made me happy in this shop, and not the least, what kind of knives could I make where I was actually able to make a living from. So the first 4 years of full-time knife making, it was strictly fixed blades, and I was just trying to build a style within what I already had, that personal sheep's foot that I called it. It was greatly inspired by some of the works of, for instance, Bud Neely at that time. And I tried building on top of that and came out with new models. And for me, I've always had this drive to design something new. I knew from other makers that had guided me that make one model and make it long enough that you get comfortable about making that, and then that's where you design a new one, and then get comfortable in making that, and just build your skill level slowly. At the same time, I knew that the folders were something that had my interest peaked, so I would try it again during the first couple of years, and still I knew, okay, it was better than the first, but I was still not there with my skill set. Some knife maker told me that if you're still struggling with keeping your grind straight, maybe you should just stick with fixed blades until you got all the aspects of that well solved, and then maybe look into folders. And I think it was in 2005 I made my first official folding knife model, and really enjoyed that, and tried to build a workshop around the need to machine titanium and figure out the mechanics in that. That's where I think it was about that time that Tersola's book came out, and that's how I cracked the code for sure.
What was that folder?
I think I call it the Revolution, because to me it was very revolutionary. It was like a 3-inch hawkbill blade. I have a picture of that first folder with weathered mammoth ivory and half exposed frame in titanium and hand rub blade.
Yeah, I think people forget how, or I guess maybe not, didn't realize how hard folding knives were back then. It was a very overwhelming thing to be like, I'm going to make a folding knife. And I was like, oh, you better make, fixed blades for 2 or 3 years before you even attempt it.
Yeah.
So when people started being like, this is my first knife, it's a folder, it's all Damascus, you're like, holy shit, times have changed.
Yeah, for sure. And that has also been extremely humbling for me to see somebody go 6 months into making knives. This is the first knife they ever built was a folder, and now they're full-time taking orders.
Oh, yeah.
Wow. And I have the highest respect for that. And especially if they're still around 10 years later. Often that's not the case, or that was often not the case maybe 10 years ago. I'm not so sure how it is now. But I've recalled seeing a lot of really, really good knife makers come out and disappear all within a couple of years.
Absolutely. Now, you were probably more on the forums then at that time too, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. Forums were the shit back then. There was several hours a day. I was just sitting, reading through articles and how to and work in progress, and just sucking in every bit of information that I could. But I also wanted to give back, so I was quite active in making these small articles about how to make this or that.
Yeah, the whip threads. We'd spend so much time.
Yeah. Yeah, I was doing a lot of that. I was actually also the editor of this small knife magazine for the Danish Knife Society, just tiny club magazine, if you will. But I was actually making articles for that as well, for the work in progress, and how to. I wanted to introduce micarta and kydex and carbon fiber and G10 to the Danish knife makers, but it never really caught on. So
Really?
yeah,
How come? What was the
yeah.
just traditional or?
Yeah, a lot of Denmark doesn't really have a knife tradition as Sweden and Norway has, but we adapted a lot of the Swedish and Norwegian knife making, not tradition, that's not the right word, but a lot of the guys making knives in Denmark make knives that looks kind of the same as they do in Norway and Sweden, and that would be birch tree blades, birch tree handles, and board forged blades, and then leather sheath that's stitched on the back. Very, very Nordic tradition. But
Yeah.
but since we don't have that in Denmark, we've never had a tradition for knife making like that. I felt that why not try and make a Danish tradition by inspiring the Danish knife makers to go outside of what they know, but it didn't really catch on. I recall I was taking part in these knife making contests in Denmark, and I won a second prize, not because they liked the knife, but because they couldn't find anything wrong with it. But I should really learn how to make a proper leather sheath, because the kind of sheaths that I were making, while they couldn't put a finger on it, it wasn't really the aesthetic that they were looking for.
Wow.
Yeah. It wasn't really an environment where creativity would thrive. You have to make it like this, or we don't really think you can make a knife.
I think there's lots of examples of that in even in American knife making, right? Sometimes there's beautiful parts of, organizations that help structure and create new makers. At the same time, it presents guardrails or limits that, right, not everyone is happy with or comfortable with or whatever. So it's an interesting thing.
Yeah, certainly. I've never really.
That was very diplomatic, Mark.
I tried to be nice. I
like that. I'm going to try to adopt that strategy myself.
Good luck, Tom. Good luck.
Right?
To tiptoe a little harder. I don't know. I mean, am I wrong?
No, you're absolutely correct, and you said it in a very
diplomatic
correct way. Yeah.
Yeah, I try. Jens, I pulled up a picture of a personal sheep's foot, and to me, I can easily see, and this may be a later example, I don't know, I can easily see the style that you created coming through even in this early design. That aspect, you've talked about it a little bit already, but the idea that you wanted to develop a style is a challenge that lots of makers face. I think we've talked about that lots on the show, right? About trying to find your place or your own path from a design perspective. Do you think that development of style is something that was helped by your industrial design studies and background, or do you think it's really a creative thing for you, or maybe some combination, I guess?
I'm quite sure that it's a combination, but the design studies open my eyes up to both designs and architecture that were very simplistic, where less is more, or put focus on details. I'm very much inspired by mid-century furniture design in Denmark, where they designed furniture for the ordinary families. Their intention was to allow for high quality furniture at a relatively affordable price. And all of these designers were architects, and what fascinates me the most is the way that they put focus on joints, and rather than trying to hide the joints of two materials, or when you have to join two pieces of wood, rather than trying to hide it, they would emphasize it and make it into a detail. And I was very much so exposed to that kind of thinking while in college, and I think that has helped me more than anything in my path to creating a style. And I'm also sure that some of it is purely coincidental. Quite early on, around 2005 or 6, I started texturing a lot of G10 and micarta, and it was really coincidental. I remember seeing an article about flint steel, I think it was called, in Blade magazine. They made a blade look like a flint blade, and I kind of liked the aesthetics of that, just not in the blade. So I made a few integral pieces, just all steel blades, where I made some texture on the handle instead, and that became my style for a number of years, that I would texture the handles very much. I started out with the steel, but right around the same time, I was talking a lot with Gary Rayner, I think his name was. He made fiber mascus, kind of micarta, but with using different cloth materials like denim and stuff like that. And he would send me samples, and I would make knives and send him pictures and feedback. And I recall one of the knives that I built with his material, it just looked so bad. I had shaped it like I would normally just shape a smooth handle, and I think it was burlap micarta or something like that. It's just, it looked bad. So then I looked at the knives that I just made with this textured steel, and I thought to myself, what if I texture the micarta or the fiber mascus, and it actually made it look less bad, at least. so that was kind of the coincidental style that I adapted and used for a number of years, and I think I created some kind of image that I was developing a lot of weird textures.
You were doing a lot of texture work, and I think, I think people don't seem to understand, once again, how new that was to the community, because you see everybody doing, I think you call it the rock pattern, kind of your flinted.
Yeah.
But you see that so much that they don't really realize that was a new kind of mind-blowing sort of thing to be like, huh. It sounds simple, and
it was very new. I don't claim at all that it was something that I invented, because several makers were doing something similar at that point. I tried to create a method and a technique that made my texture look a certain way, and that became kind of my signature pattern for a while. And then soon after, I started just going nuts with circular saws or drills and just try and do whatever I could to the surface of a handle to see what interesting patterns I could create.
Right. And to your point, Jens, I don't know that you're the first, like you said, but I think you popularized it and you made it mainstream. I still call it Anso texture when I do it.
Cool, thanks.
Well, I mean, just kind of pointing credit to where it's due, and I also have to call it something, so why not?
But it also seems that the knife-making world were much smaller back then. We all knew each other. We all knew what each of us were doing because we were all sharing in the same forum.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And
I remember those days on USN where you, me, and Birch all had really active forums. Those were pretty exciting times.
Yeah,
They were.
and I loved it. I really think that we had a very active community, both makers in between and our customers or wannabe customers could look us over the shoulder and just follow our process. But I really enjoyed that creative space that we created between each other, and I loved the build-offs and all that.
Mm-hmm.
That was really fun.
Yeah. One of the things that I really remember on USN, on your forum, and this was about the same time, was you kind of stopped taking orders and started doing the outbreak stuff. And it felt like you were really trying to experiment with the different textures and designs. And tell us about that experience and why you came up with the outbreaks.
Yeah, sure. That was probably around 2007. And I had this idea that I wanted to both explore more creative techniques of for instance, texturing or grinding, but at the same time, I wanted to explore more designs and more designs. So I would design a new folder model. I would make 5 prototypes, if you will, outbreak 1 to 5, and each of them would feature a different texture from each other. Not necessarily from one outbreak model to the next, but just between the 5 of them. I would see, okay, what kind of aesthetic would go well with this model, or what can I do with this new variation of G10 or whatever. And so it would allow me a great deal of creative freedom. I could make whatever I wanted to make, and I priced them a little higher than my regular models because they were rare in that I only made these 5. So I think in 2007 and 8, I made a new model once a month or so. And a lot of those outbreaks later became regular models that I then would take orders for. But at that point, I already explored what would work for me in regards to grinds, grind heights, different kind of compound grinds. I did a lot of that back then. What kind of textures were cool? What would be feasible to offer for orders, and what would just be one of a kind because either the technique were horribly time-consuming or just wrong. Some of it was even dangerous, just the way that I was working around with angular grinders with weird constructions on them. Or I would go to a hardware store and just go look at drills and grinding bits and saws and thinking, okay, what if I put this circular saw blade in a drill press and see what I can do with it? And some of it was directly stupid, but some of it turned out really cool. And it was like my playground to explore my creative sides, and I really enjoyed it. And I think I ended up making, 20 something different outbreak models at that point, and about half of them or so turned into regular models.
That's awesome. That feels like both that and the earlier comments about having having a number of makers collected in one place like we had on USN, both to me, and this might be off base, but both to me ring back to that design school situation, right? You mentioned already the idea of being in a lab or shop or university area where there are other people working on their own projects. And in this case, they were all knives, but different makers with different aesthetics and processes, and in some cases tools as well, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Available to them. And seeing what other people are doing, like you said, looking over the shoulder, not just collectors looking over the shoulder of makers, but makers looking over one another's shoulders as well. And I think that's fascinating because it's the same kind of idea, right? It's today they would call it an incubator or whatever, right? For creative things, but I think that's really interesting. And then the other part, the design exercise aspect, right? We do that with cars where we'll do a design study, and I think that's what your Outbreak projects remind me of, are design studies where, okay, I have something that I need to make, and I'm going to take a number of shots at it and put them out here and see what they all look like. Because sometimes you don't know until you actually do it, and you can get reaction from people and sense check. I think this is cool. Do other people think this is cool? Like you said, can I do it twice in a row? Sometimes that can be a challenge, right? Or like you said, the business aspect of it. Is this actually viable for me to do on, a larger basis or as a standard thing? Sometimes lots of beautiful things get created that are too cumbersome or time consuming, or you know what I mean, go through too many tools to complete. And it's an interesting thing. So it's very common with, I think, design people and design communities to go through that same kind of design study exercise.
Yeah, and what I thought was the coolest thing about it was that I was having so much fun. I was making exactly what I wanted to, and I was actually getting paid to do it, which was which was wonderful, right. and it created a big interest in my knives and what will he come up with next. And it was, to me, it was really, really cool to work like that, because that was the closest creative period that could compare to my time in college, where you were just playing around, really.
Right.
Now, at that point, were you on pencil and paper, or were you using CAD?
I've been using CAD since 97, 98 on everything I make, really.
Really?
I was taught Rhino during design school, and I really liked the accurate way of using that tool. I would always pencil out, as I still do. I pencil out every single design that I make to a certain point. I almost never design directly in CAD. I've done it a few times, but almost every time I will design something, at least just to get the idea down on paper, and then take that image and then use as a backdrop in Rhino and draw it out from there.
Yeah, it's for me, it's really hard. There's no way to judge space or size or perspective when you do it just on the screen. I have to start. But I mean, I spent a lot of time doing stuff on paper, and I'd say CAD was probably one of the most important things for me to learn as a knife maker.
It just takes your work to a much more precise standard, good or bad, really. But I've always had this desire to make a precise drawing. Also, before learning CAD, I would use the 0.5 mechanical pencil, just so I was drawing very, very detailed. And I think that translated well into CAD. I also draw very fast and very rough, just with a 2B pencil, whatever the creative situation dictates. But being able to take a rough sketch and relatively quickly make it into something that, if for nothing else, is ugly in a very precise way.
Yeah. Well, to me, it's almost like everything ripples out from the pivot or that area. And if you can get your stop pin and everything located perfectly, precisely, then mistakes won't be as big the further away from those you get. You can dial everything in after that.
Yeah, for sure.
I've enjoyed that aspect of it.
I've never, well, I think I tried it once where I would make a paper pattern and then cut it out with scissors and put a pin in the pivot area and turn the blade and the handle around, but I hated it. So learning CAD was really important for me to pursue folders.
Yeah.
So I would print out a paper drawing and glue it on a piece of plastic or steel, and then grind and drill and make a template. But it would always start out as a precise drawing that I could print out once more if the template didn't work out quite as intended, or if it got damaged or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's like having a digital pattern.
Yeah.
Was kind of basically what you were doing, right? There's a durability aspect to that that's really nice. Yeah. Interesting. So what about, when you have all the drawings in CAD and you can pull them up and make changes and other things, the natural progression, I think, is to eventually use that with a machine, right? That can turn that into parts. And so how did you get into the CNC aspect of that? Because it seems like, this may not be accurate, so maybe that's part of the question, is, to me, it seemed like you were one of the people who was quick to adopt that, maybe because you had your catalog in CAD already. But how did that transition happen for you?
Well, it definitely helped me a ton that I was already trained in CAD. But I think one of the reasons why I was looking at CNCs at an early point was that at that point I was making designs for factories already. And I could see that producing in a more practical way would allow me to be more productive, but also it would put less strain on me as a maker, where I could, if for nothing else, get a more efficient bandsaw really in a CNC. Just cut out some of the really, really hard labor involved in knife making. But around 2009, I started looking at the time, quite few makers who had CNCs. It was, as far as I recall, or the ones that I knew about, was less than a handful, really. It was Ken Onion, for one, Neil Blackwood, Kevin Wilkins. I think those were the major makers at the point that I knew of, at least, who had CNCs. And I could just see benefits of that. And at that point, my business were going not fantastic, but I could see that in order to stay in the business and stay relevant, I had to think in that direction. So,
Jens, I'm sorry to interrupt, but when you say you had to, you're thinking of it as you had to, from a productivity perspective, you needed to take that time out of the process to be able to improve the business aspect of it, or to help with design things that you wanted to do next, or maybe it's a combination of those things.
I think it's a combination of me striving to become more effective, but also striving to master some techniques that would allow me to make things that I weren't able to with manual machines. I did have a couple of pantographs at that point. I had the biggest decal pantograph and really loved it, and it allowed me to replicate a design a little better than I could by grinding to a scribe line. I think I wanted to be able to make a more precise version of my drawing than I felt I was able to do by just by hand. And also I was really, really tired of bandsawing titanium. There was I had one of those knife maker special Harbor Freight kind of bandsaws at that point, and it sucked. Just and I was making frame locks more or less on everything, and just bandsawing thick titanium. Just it was horrible. So but at the same time, I could see what some of those knife makers with CNCs were doing, making inlays and it seemed that their production was speeded up somewhat. They weren't mass producing in any way, but it seemed that the CNC as a tool helped them explore more creative ways of making a knife than I was able to do with what I had. And I could also see that it could potentially be the future of knife making. I wanted to make more than I could. And at that point I had a 2 or 3 years backlog of knives. And I had stopped taking orders at this point, and I didn't really want to become buried in orders. And to return to the business aspect of it, one of the things that I've always been focused on, and something that has been driving me, is try to find ways to stay relevant in my market. And I saw the CNC as a tool that could help me do that. One of the most sad things that I've ever known is walking around Blade Show and seeing some of these great knife makers that used to be top of the game, and they still produce wonderful knives, but sitting at the table with knives for sale because they somehow didn't succeed in staying relevant, even though that they still make tremendously great knives. That kind of scared me. So I knew that in order to stay relevant, I had to also stay focused on the technical aspect. Where was this trade going?
You didn't have to call Tom out like that.
No, I know. Sorry, Tom. Sorry.
So, one of the
guys.
Yeah. Don't take it personal, Tom, even though it was. Dude. So one of the interesting things is this, there's a very long running conversation in knife making about using CNC or not, and people not using it, and that being almost like a badge of honor or whatever. Yeah. And I think I can predict what Jens's perspective is on that, but what is your perspective on that whole thing, Jens? It seems to me that certainly today there's enough room in the market for all of it, and people that want that, sort of background story on the knife that they buy can get it. But
I've always seen it as any craftsman during the time of man has strived to use the best tools that he could to make whatever he was making. He would always look for a better way to make let's just use the knife as an example. during time, from the Stone Age and going up in time, every craftsman have looked for a better way to make his work stand out from the guy next to him. And the same for me. I see the CNC as just another tool, especially since that I can make a knife with whatever tools that I have available and have done so. I've even gone backwards, because if I had a workshop available for some time at my parents' place when I was younger, I would still make a knife even though I had a better tool back home. But I would make do with whatever they had in their shop so I could keep making, just because it satisfied my needs. So fast forward to the CNC, to me, that's just another tool. And if I could get something cooler than a CNC and I could afford it and learn to use it, I would do that. To me, it has been important that I learned the trade. I'm not saying that it's important for everyone. If they can buy their way into using or have somebody create what they need to do to create their knives, that's fine. I think there's just too many people judging how craftsmen make whatever they're making. But as long as you're open about what you do and how you do it, I think anybody should be free to make knives however they want to, and their customers will decide if they will stand for that.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
If I'm sure there's makers who don't make any of their own parts other than fit them together. I don't see them as any less knife makers than anybody else. I think also that is probably based on my origin in knife making, where basically everyone around me were making knives by what by American standard would be buying a kit. They would buy a blade and fashion a handle and a sheath for it from parts that they bought. Where I've always made my own blades, but the tradition wasn't there in Denmark. So I've always, at least I hope so, been open to people making whatever they want to make, however they want to make it. And I don't see the CNCs as any different. I recall in the good old forum days where people would be judged if they used an angle iron and clamped the blades on that and a grinding fixture, and they would be judged less knife makers because they used a fixture to grind the blades. And I always thought it was rubbish.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's people draw weird lines in the sand, and they're very arbitrary usually.
But I see it as an open market or free market that the money will decide, or the customer will decide if whatever you're doing is acceptable or not. If you're selling everything you can make and more, well, good on you. Then you're onto something that is very right for you. It might not be right for everyone, but it's definitely right for you.
Yeah. I think it's a common theme, right? It's not specific to knives. I think if anybody who's dug into the world of craftspeople, there's a curmudgeon aspect of it, right? And some of it based in tradition. And I understand why people are concerned about that piece of it, right? That they don't want it to be, they don't want to see the craft degraded somehow. At the same time, like you said, there's room for everyone. And if people use different tools, then they use different tools, and the product in the end has to speak for itself. And like you said, the business happens or it doesn't. And if it does, then how is it bad? How could it be
But
bad?
imagine what a sad world we would be in if everybody listened to those saying, well, you can't start using antler to chip that flint stone. You have to use whatever. Or
Right.
300 years ago, when some Italian hand engraver saw a guy build a gouache machine and said, well,
Right.
what's that rubbish? That's cheating.
Yes.
It's putting a negative lid on top of creativity by trying to dictate what is right and what is wrong is just horrible.
I like the putting it that way.
I
like
do
that.
too.
So fast forward, Jens, you're maybe not fast forward, but so you make these Outbreak series of knives, and somewhere along the way, the world continues to change, right? And we transition over time, maybe a little bit away from forum stuff and a little bit into social media stuff, and the knife market changes as well and expands at an insane rate. You want to talk about how that path happens for you from the Outbreak series and that family of knives forward from there?
I actually think that the CNC was a major factor in that. I bought the first CNC machine in 2010, I think, and started working on that backlog of orders of 3 or 4 years. But the CNC allowed me to make the parts just a little quicker. And the models that I liked making started changing because the CNCs allowed me to explore new techniques. One of them was getting away from milling the lock on my manual machine, but actually starting exploring that on the CNC. In the beginning, I was really only using it as a glorified bandsaw because I was just making parts that I would then take to my manual mill and then start cutting the lock and start fitting things together. But the CNC was working on new parts when I was behind the manual mill. So I really saw it as a way for me to be more productive without having to hire anyone. But I recall I bought that first machine and it was just sitting in my shop for 6 months. I was just looking at it and I was terrified. One of my first experiences was by manually programming, milling a square or something, and I rammed a 1/2-inch carbide end mill straight into my vise, and it sounded like a shotgun going off. And that made me turn off the machine, and I didn't turn it on again for 3 months. I bought it knowing absolutely nothing about CNCs, and I had nobody around me who knew about CNC machines either. So I was just like, how hard can it be? I know CAD, it should be easy, but it was definitely not easy.
Famous last words.
Yeah. But then I found this metal college thing where I took a 4-day course in G-code programming, manual G-code programming, which I had absolutely no need for, but that actually made me kind of crack the code of the language. It made me understand what the post processor was doing, what these kind of codes meant in the machine. It kind of made me understand just a little bit, and I just took one project at a time, just making. My first project was these aluminum handles for holding folder blades while grinding. And each project that I fed into the machine just taught me a little more and a little more and a little more. Started out by just roughing out profiles of parts and then adding a chamfer here and there and milling a hole or drilling a hole and just adding to that. So it was a very slow learning curve, but basically self-taught after that 4 days training of G-code. But what it allowed me to do was, after I started finishing those orders that I had, it allowed me to explore inlays, for instance. That was some of the first interesting work for me was and something that wasn't easily available for me. I could do it somehow by using the pantographs, but frankly I didn't quite understand the process needed in using them for that either. So the CNC opened up a whole new toolbox for me to explore in how I designed my knives. One thing that was really important for me was that I didn't want a tool that would cage me in. I didn't want the CNC to be something that dictated how I made my knives. I wanted to use the CNC where it made sense for me and where it would be relevant, and then use whatever capability it allowed me to explore new designs.
And so where does your story go from there? And so you embrace the CNC, you learn some skills with a little help, but a lot the hard way also, right? To be able to do some things that you didn't feel like you really knew how to do before, or didn't, maybe in a repeatable way, or maybe not in a way that made sense to you. How do you get from there to more recent times with the knives you're making now, and the transition of your business? Because it's changed a lot, I think, since then.
Oh,
right?
yeah, for sure. Yeah, my business has changed a lot, and definitely because I suddenly had the CNC available. One thing that I learned quite early on was that I couldn't use the full potential of the machine, or the full capacity of the machine for making knives, at least not in the fashion I was making knives at that time. So it would be just standing still for probably a couple of weeks per month, because I was mainly just roughing out parts and then finishing them on my manual mill. So I started thinking about what kind of product could I make on the CNC that would allow me to use its capacity and make a little money on that as well. And at that point, the whole everyday carry tool gadget thing was becoming a thing very slowly. So I started designing these small tools and carabiners, and that was meant to keep the CNC busy while it wasn't making knife parts. But it was actually not too far into that where I realized I was making pretty good money on making these carabiners and stuff, that it was getting hard to justify making knife parts when I was making more knives on the carabiners, or easier money at least. So that was actually the point where I started thinking about buying machine number 2, because the knives is what drives me. The tools and carabiners is something where I explore my design skills, and also a way for me to spread out the income over more than one stream as the knives. So that's where I bought the CNC machine number 2 or 3 years later. And I think that the business has just grown steadily since then, and the knives have become more complicated, and I'm trying to make things that intrigue me, and just trying to push myself. So I started making 3D machining quite early on, and just trying to learn that, and so the CNC opened up for that toolbox of things where I feel that I'm still just scratching the surface of what it's capable of doing if I'm able to make it do what I want.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it seems like you mentioned very early in our trip down memory lane, right, that you had production deals with companies to producing designs early on, right? And I think that for makers, I think that can be a really interesting thing to help smooth out the realities of running a business, right? Having those kinds of deals, whether it's people producing your designs on a license or some kind of production arrangement or otherwise. And that's something that it sounds like you were able to integrate and carry from fairly early on.
Yeah. I recall one of my proudest moments as a knife maker was when I received an email from Sal Glesser, founder of Spyderco. This has to be around 2006-07, where he showed interest in one of my models called the Rock Lobster and wanted to buy one and see if it was a suitable match for their company. And at that point, I had a license to use the Spyderco hole for a number of years on my custom knives, so I was definitely aware of Spyderco, and I really admired the design language that using the Spyderco hole allowed me, having a one hand opened knife without adding to the knife, but actually subtracting from the knife. Again, just keeping it as simple as possible. Drill a hole, and you had a wonderful way of opening a folder.
Yeah.
So that project started in 2007, and I think it came out in 2008 or 9, and that opened up my eyes really for designing for companies. I had a chance a few years earlier, actually in 2001, that was not going to happen because of 9/11. There was a deal that just didn't come through back then. So, but due to my education as a designer, I knew that the usual way of making a living for a designer was royalty-based or project-based design work. So I was really intrigued about working with Spyderco and came out with the second design with them a year or two later. And that really opened up my eyes for, again, adding streams of income to my business, because as opposed to a lot of other entrepreneurs, I've never really seen myself as entrepreneurs, but a lot of people with an idea to make a business, that's a business that they run because the idea was fruitful to make a business, and then they will come up with another idea and maybe make another business. But for me, making knives and designing knives is what I have to do. So there's really no alternative for me in doing what I do. So in order for me to secure a base for me to support my family and do what I love and not have to go out and take an ordinary job and having a boss, which I really can't think of anything more horrible than that. Designing for factories was just the perfect opportunity for me, and that's something that I've been working very hard to accomplish since.
So you're part of this arrangement today, a business called Giant Mouse.
Yeah.
And so can you talk briefly about what that is and how it came to be?
Yeah, certainly. About 6 years ago, Jesper Voxnes and myself were at the New York Custom Show. We had been traveling to shows as buddies for a number of years and would hang out with the same guys at night. And one of our mutual friends, Jim Worth, went out having a beer with us one night, and we started discussing this whole factory designing for factories and what challenging that creates, and some of the frustrations that we had with designing for factories. Because one thing is designing what we individually would think as the perfect knife for this specific company, but the reality is that you hand over a drawing, and often the result is not necessarily what you had in mind. But also the nature of royalties is that you get a very small percentage of the sale, and often that alone is not a great deal of money, and certainly not something that you will make a living of unless you're one of these extremely talented guys in the past. That a guy like Canonian that has been a great icon for me, and he was one of the first knife makers, as I believe, who were able to make a living from partially from designing knives. Anyways, Jim suggested that why don't you just make your own company and have the knives you design make, and then you score the total profit, and you have complete ownership about how the knives will be made and to what quality, and then that really sparked an interest in both Jesper and I, and the rest is really history.
So kind of a super collaboration on a production basis, sort of. Yeah.
So what makes Giant Mouse different from what Jesper and I individually designed for factories? We kind of shared the factory market in the way that we have some factories that we both design for, and we have individually some manufacturers that we design for separate from each other. But other than two factory projects, one kitchen knife project with Viper of Italy and one folder with Spyderco, we've never designed anything in collaboration before. So where Giant Mouse separates from anything else is that it's solely made of designs that we make together. So every single knife that Giant Mouse puts out is designed by Jesper and me in collaboration.
Very cool. And it seems like it's been a successful project for sure.
It certainly is. It's grown into a monster, really. It started out as a fun project that we would do on the side, and our intentions was to put out 1 or 2 designs a year, but it's just grown and grown and grown, and now we are 5 years into this project, and it's become big thing for us, both as running a business, but it's definitely time consuming and just super fun, and it's a rare opportunity for us as friends to work together and actually make money doing it. And of course it's a double-bladed sword in the way that, yes, you have full creative freedom to make whatever you want, but on the other hand, you also have to keep production companies in check. You have to deal with customer feedback and customer care. You have to deal with the whole finance thing of business, whereas when you just in quotation mark design for a company, you hand over a design, and then a year later you start getting checks in the mail.
Right. The added ownership and income aspect of it is not free, right?
No, for sure. It comes with a lot of work, but it's a really rare occasion that you get so fortunate to actually be able to create something from the ground up as we have, and just see the fruit of it. It's really rewarding for us.
Did you have any concerns going in on the project, Jens, that, one of the risks of that kind of situation, on one hand, it's a beautiful thing to be able to do business with friends. It's also can ruin friendships very quickly. Was that a concern that you had? And have you had to kind of keep mindful or stay mindful of that as you worked your way to the spot that you are today with Giant Mouse?
It's definitely something that we are all aware of, and it can be challenging to have 3 alpha males run a company together because that's really what it is. We are 3 guys who have equal shares of ownership in the company. So, but I think we've been able to create a work environment where we leave the ego at the door and say things when it's needed. And of course, every now and again we butt heads, but it's then we meet up and share a meal and a drink, and everything is good. And of course it's a challenge, but I think that it's a very good start when you're such good friends to begin with, and that has really helped a lot. And you'll be able to tolerate more from your friends, I think, than if it was some random business partner.
Yeah, and you start out with the trust piece in a much stronger place than if you had simply approached a random investor or, something like that.
Yeah, for sure.
So how are you doing things now? What is this about the online show that you do?
Well, these past 2 years of COVID-19 has really put a lot of strain and stress on me, just in regards to I function really well being a hermit in my shop, and but I also thrive a lot by coming out to shows and meeting people, and these past 2 years has just been one big void of that. I attended the Paris Knife Show about a month ago, and that's it. So one of the things that I really enjoy in preparing for a knife show is that, like with the Test Lab Outbreak, I make exactly what I want. And these past 2 years has been all about filling orders. And frankly, while I truly am grateful about being able to fill out orders and that my knives are sought out enough that people will order them, I just had this urge to make something for what could be compared as for a knife show. So last month I started what I call Launch 15, which was a concept that I developed where I would once a month make knives and gadgets and just offer up for sale. It's really more something that I've done to keep me on my toes and make something interesting and new, and not just fill out orders and just in big quotation mark, but something where I can start exploring my creativity a little more again on a continuously basis.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. I mean, having a show or something, a deadline is very helpful for making sure we get stuff done sometimes.
Certainly. And I know myself well enough that if I just say to myself, well, at certain intervals, I should put up an online knife show, I know that I would put up one, and then suddenly 6 months or 12 months would have gone past and I would have forgotten all about it. And then suddenly, there was one thing I promised myself a while back.
Right.
So that was actually the main reason why I decided to do it once a month, which is definitely putting some deadlines on me, and it's of course it's pressure that I put on myself, and I can adjust it as I want to, and I need to find a balance in it. But right now, I just think it's really fun to to alternate between filling out orders and make something and make it available. And so far, it's been really good.
Well, I think shows help us sometimes push ourselves to make something different and special, So I think that's another reason it's a good idea.
Yeah, for sure. But also, I've experienced this weird thing about shows in general, and maybe it's because, especially a show like the Blade Show, it's just grown and grown and grown. And I've kind of felt like I've been almost drowning in that huge show, and I guess this is a way for me to try and again renew myself and try and do something different again to try and stay relevant. Where the competition at a show like the Blade Show with 1,000 knife makers, 1,500 knife makers, it's enormous. And with the online thing, it's definitely a much easier thing to arrange, and then you don't have to travel for it. You don't have to be jet lagged for a week. I'm not saying that this won't be instead of going to shows, because I will definitely still be going to shows, but I might be changing what kind of shows I will set up at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we've talked a lot on this show about some of the micro show, or like Tom's Trunk Show, or, our friend Lucas Burnley recently had a gallery show. Things like that let people connect in a much closer way. And I think our collective experience anyway is they're a lot of fun, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's really cool to be able to actually have a conversation and spend a few minutes chatting about life and things, right? That seems to get harder to do as the shows get bigger. So
yeah, for sure. I was finding myself just standing behind the table at Blade Show, and I would sell my knives and I would have my lotteries and all, but I would just be standing there for 3 days, and hardly anybody had time to actually stop and have a relevant conversation. And I've tried different things in the past. I really loved the New York Knife Show because of its relatively small size.
Yeah.
I'm not attending the one in is it Nashville this
Nashville,
year?
yeah.
Yeah. My next show is TKI in Vegas in January. But those smaller shows where it's actually made so you have time to talk, that's something I will definitely be looking for instead of these huge shows like Blade Show. I would still go to Blade Show, but I've been debating if I want to have a table there or not. And right now I'm probably more in favor of not having a table at that show anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting times. I tend to think of timelines with milestones, and the reality is it's a constant evolution, right? And so just like the evolution from offline knife era to online knife era, and now the COVID thing has certainly driven change, right? Because it was the whole show thing for me was always a central part of what this was all about. Very, very important to the whole existence of knives in my life was the idea of going to shows and seeing my friends and, pursuing knives there and whatever, right? All the stuff that goes into that. And so with COVID, it's been really interesting to see how that changes. And I think it's even caused changes in, the online stuff as well. And I look forward to seeing where it goes from here, because I think, we've been talking for a long time about this growth of small shows or micro shows. And I think we're going to see more of that, right? People are excited to get back to a show and see one another. I went to the Arts and Metal show. Michael was there, and it was really nice to see everyone, but it was also nice that it was very small, right? I appreciated the fact that I got to see my friends, and it was in a much smaller, easier environment. And that's attractive and something that just makes it more enjoyable for me personally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I totally agree, and that's I definitely agree with your point of view that the shows are for talking and interacting with your friends and to be available to new customers so they can actually see and feel your work. And those big shows were just growing to be monsters, and to me it seemed like fewer and fewer people would be standing or visiting each table just because of the stress of getting to see everything.
Yeah, there's so much to see, right? You have to move so fast that, I don't know, it gets hectic. And that to me takes a lot of the fun of it away.
Yeah.
So Jens, for people that want to check out the online show that you talked about, can you say the name of it again and where they can find it?
Yeah, well, it's available on my website. It's called Anso of Denmark.com. And I call the show Launch 15 because it's every month on the 15th, at least for as long as I find it relevant for me. So, but I'm posting about it on social media, Instagram and Facebook and what have you.
Okay. So today, Anso of Denmark is kind of your umbrella for your work. Is that the structure that you think of, or is that for some reason I associated Anso of Denmark with the kitchen knife projects? But
yeah, I think I made a change in the way that I saw my company 3 or 4 years ago because my old website and my old identity, if you will, was Anso Knives, but I felt that I was more than that. But also I had the urge to move further and just develop the company more. I saw that as a goal in itself as well. So I felt that the name Anso Knives was just limiting me from exploring new ideas, especially with all the accessories that I make. And I came up with the name Anso of Denmark. The kitchen knives falls under that brand, but it's not defining the kitchen knife itself.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. So Giant Mouse is kind of its own project that you're involved in. Anso of Denmark, you're doing custom knives as well. Is there any other brand stuff that people should look for when they're looking for your work?
No, not really. I decided to brand the kitchen knives under Anso of Denmark Gastro mainly because I felt that would allow me to expose my brand to a much broader amount of people than just the knife related people. Kitchen knives just have so much broader appeal. And I had the idea that if you would go onto a website for kitchen knives, but also see all these kinds of folding knives, and that would kind of muddy the water. So I kind of separated those two. So while they're under the same company umbrella, I kind of parted the two into two different websites, but both under the brand Anso of Denmark.
Okay. Jens, we really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us. I found it a very interesting conversation. I'm always glad to hear friends talk about finding joy in their work. And I'm glad to know that you are finding outlets for creativity and things to have fun with. And I think sometimes that's, you mentioned early in the conversation, there are lots of makers who made nice knives and aren't around anymore in the business, and for a bunch of reasons, including, I think, sometimes working the fun right out of it and not being able to find joy in what they're doing. And so I'm glad to know that you're finding that for yourself.
Oh, I certainly am. And thanks so much for having me on the show. It's really the only knife-related podcast that I'm listening to, mainly because of you guys, obviously, but also just because it's a really good show, and it's a good shop listening as well.
Well, thank you.
It's always good to talk to you, Jens.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we need to thank our friends that support us on Patreon. We get a couple more, it seems like every week or two. And so thanks folks for joining us. If you're new to our Patreon, thanks for hopping on the bus with us. For folks that have continued to support us, and some of them for a very long time now, we deeply appreciate you. Your support helps us keep the show going and keep us in good equipment. I think we might have to buy another guest mic. We had one finally fail, so it's going to come back to me in a box and non-functional form and go on a shelf somewhere. We'll have to figure out what to do with that. So we've had microphones traveling all over the country for 4 years now, which is crazy to think about, to get our guests online with us. And so that wouldn't be possible without help from Patreon and folks like George at American Metal Exchange. So we appreciate everybody's support. We have lots going on. We're about to wrap up season 4 and start season 5, which is really, really crazy to think about.
That is crazy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it doesn't seem like we've been doing it that long, but I guess like earlier in the conversation when I was like, didn't we talk about this with Bob? I guess if I can't remember a recording we did, then that means we've done a bunch of them. So
Not saying much for me.
Michael can't remember lunch.
Mm-mm.
So
I can. I just had it.
Yeah, it looked delicious, by the way. Okay, well, thanks again, Jens, for talking with us and sharing a bunch of your history with us. Would love to have you come back sometime in the future, and we'll look for a good way to do that. I think it's always great to have great guests, and we've had a number of them have taken the opportunity to chat with us again. So,
well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a great pleasure, and I would love to come back and talk some more.
Yeah. Jens warned me that he could be a multi-episode guy. I think we got the high points in, but yeah, there might be some other stuff we want to dig in on a little bit later on.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I have a lot of notes.
Jens also asked me if he could curse on the show, and I said, yes, fire away. Sean is he's the king, and so he wasn't here this time, so.
I was a little in doubt about that. I had this seminar at the Blade Show, and I recall Tom and Lucas Burnley standing in the back and just making hand gestures that I was swearing too much, and I should put a lid on it. But maybe that crowd was a little less used to swearing than your listeners are.
So you're saying we can swear on the show? What?
I know. I don't think we do. I guess we do, but it doesn't seem like we do it a ton, yet occasionally we get somebody that gets spun up about it.
Sean is profane.
Gratuitous.
Sean is profane. I'm sure he would cheer loudly in the background knowing that he's been classified.
Proficiently profane.
He's very proficient at profanity. That's true. Yeah.
And I like it.
Well, darn it, we do too.
I'd have to say that he probably doesn't care one way or the other.
No, I think he takes pride in being profane, personally. I think that's a badge of honor.
Sam is given zero care.
All right.
But yeah, maybe.
All right. Well, thanks again, and we'll talk to everybody next time.
Thanks, all.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
To learn more about our makers, you can find Tom Crine on the web at crineknives.net, in his Facebook group, Crine Knives, or in his Instagram account, @CrineKnives. For Michael Birch, check birchtreeblades.com, Facebook group Birch Tree Blade Works, or Michael's Instagram @BirchTreeBlades. For myself and the Raygun Bead Project, we're on the web at raygundivision.com. We have a Facebook group called Raygun Division, or my personal Instagram @msteiner. For those interested in photos, references from the show, or some discussion about the show itself, you can find us on the web at markofthemaker.com, in a Facebook group called Mark of the Maker, or on our Instagram @markofthemaker. Last but not least, the ultra cool and haunting background music we use for the show is a piece called Noir Guitar by Stevie's Amp Shack, found at the Free Music Archive and licensed under Creative Commons CC BY 4.0. Thanks for listening.